Yeah, so welcome everybody to the Trees Collaborate, and it's really great to have Neil Clennell from the Wychwood Forest Trust talking to us about his work. So I know we've had a quick roundup about who's who. Um, so I think without further ado, shall I hand over to Neil and do you want to introduce yourself and tell us about what you're up to and what you think is important for us to grab hold of, Neil?
Sure,
Welcome.
absolutely. Thank you. Cheers, Marcus. Hello, good evening, everyone. I know some of you. It's good to see you again. For those a couple of you that don't know me, my name is Neil Clennell, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Wychwood Forest Trust. I suppose I could best describe this as a kind of, a small regional environmental NGO. We've been around for about 30 years, and our basic purpose really is to try and, raise awareness of the lack of woodland cover in Britain, and try to not reforest the whole Wychwood, but at least kind of drive for more, more primary forest in an area which used to be one of Britain's most important. And of course, it's got one or two reasonably large-sized remnants of ancient forest knocking around. So our political boundary is more or less West Oxfordshire, if you like, but we kind of operate largely across the old Wychwood Forest where there's opportunity. So and we are now over those 30 years, we've gone from being largely a kind of influencing, information distributing organization, and one which for a long time quite enthusiastically planted lots of trees and had tree planting targets. But we ended up buying some land and then acquiring more land, and then one or two legacies come in, and before you know it, quite deliberately, we've got a small suite of land holdings, nature reserves, call them, whatever you like. So we found ourselves in the place that all organizations like ourselves end up in, that we want to change the world and have, a more environmentally enjoyable countryside, more nature, all that sort of stuff. But it's compelling to buy and have land because then you can do things entirely your own way and set your own gold standards. But even the biggest and most powerful organizations can never buy enough land to really make a difference. So you have to start thinking about who owns all the other land, and trying to influence them. So you sort of put your resources on a cline from at one end influencing farmers, big estate society, and at the other end, it's quite compelling to get hold of nature reserves and manage them the way that you think sets a good example. So that's kind of where we are and what we do at the moment. Um, of those sites that we own, some of them you would recognize as kind of traditional nature reserves. So some of them are grasslands and a sedge marsh, and we have a fully mature ancient woodland of our own. But the sort of sites, the other half of our sites are the ones which really I find more professionally interesting. So over my long career, I ended up coming to the conclusion that it's brilliant for nature, for wildlife trusts and Wychwood Forest Trust to preserve and look after land and try to restore it. But no one seems to be really trying to make the nature reserves of the future. And we know that we don't have enough woodland coverage, and we know that our nature reserves are too small and infrequent and too far apart. So it's the sort of restoration of formal industrial or low quality agricultural land, which I think is probably an important part of the way forward for trying to reverse the declines of biodiversity. So, of our restoration sites, if you like, again, we've done those in slightly different ways depending on physical and funding and social sort of factors that we have to consider. But the couple I'm going to show you tonight, one is called Foxburrow Wood. Um, Seeing as there's not many of you, hands up, have you been to Foxburrow Wood? Yeah, the one in Hayley to the north of Whitney. Okay, not too many. Anyone been to Gibbets Hill, the other one I'm going to talk about, the kind of new one? Yeah, I know a few of you have. Okay, so they're both almost on opposite sides of Whitney. Um, Foxburrow Wood was been restored by buying lots of trees and planting them in the ground and establishing a woodland that way. Gibbets Hill is a more recent acquisition, and for reasons I'll show you, we decided to approach that one in a different way and let the woodland regenerate itself under its own steam. And I have opinions about planting trees.
not against it in principle, and I won't labour it too much because you can ask me questions at the end. But I do believe in, right tree, right place, right tree, right place for the right reason. And we plant lots of trees, establishing gapping up hedgerows. But I've come to believe that if you have a reasonably expansive bit of land and you want to have your primary goal is to have a woodland, which is going to be good for biodiversity in the future, it's not the best thing to buy the trees and just put them all in and walk away. I think you get a different set of environmental responses and sort of outcomes if you trust in nature to sort of grow woodlands and forests just the way it did long before we ever came along and started, inventing spiral guards and the rest of it. So I have my opinions. I do believe actually that, there is a place for the sort of thing that we've done at Foxburrow, and I'll explain why. But I'm going to kind of contrast a couple, show you some pictures of the sites, and then hopefully leave it open for some questions, really. Can you all hear me all right? I'm the tail end of a lurgy, and I know that I start to mumble a bit at the moment. So if you can't, just sing out, okay? And I'll shout a bit louder. Right. So,
Oh, yeah, you're fine. Yeah.
good.
Welcome to David as well.
Okay. Can we all see that?
Yeah, we
Excellent.
can see
Okay.
that.
So this is Foxburrow Wood. So this is a mishmash of slides from various talks, but it's quite useful in a way because this is Foxburrow Wood. This was the first bit of land that Wychwood Forest Trust bought, and I'm told by those who remember it, there was a lot of hand wringing. Should we, shouldn't we go into land ownership and management? And we decided we did, and I'm very pleased about that. And so we had this site, which is 7 hectares. It was pretty much empty. So those 7 hectares were a series of fields which used to be grazed by cattle and then latterly, so it was a dairy farm at one point, and then it was heavily grazed with sheep. The only, apart from the sort of heavily grazed agricultural grassland, the only sort of real biomass vegetation was this hedge. So this is a hedge that runs pretty much bisects the site in the middle. It's monotypic hawthorn. It's been there a while. It's of some antiquity, but that's the only bit of hedge or woody plants apart from this, which is an ash tree on the boundary. So nothing else in there. It was effectively a sort of a blank slate. And you can see the approach was to design a plan to to make a community woodland, and raise the necessary grant funding to buy the materials, engage the community, and plant it that way. So that's what happened. And over the course of a couple of years, between about 2010 and 12, a little over 10,500 trees were planted on this land. And you can see here, so this is looking north to south, fairly typical close-knit arrangement of trees, the reason they're planted in these densities is because they're sort of requirements of woodland creation grants. They like a certain planting density. They demand all of this kind of protection. So you don't just buy your tree, you have to buy a spiral guard and a stake and a rubber doodah to stick them together. So it's a reasonably lucrative industry. And this site was planted. You can see the young trees that have gone in. I mean, amazing community effort. There was everyone from local schools to the fire brigade to, corporate volunteer teams as well as our own volunteers. But over a couple of years, in they went. This is some pictures I found in the archives of that first year or two after planting. So, um, in this one, this is kind of the entrance just after you step out the car park. Nothing there apart from a few little twigs in the ground. This bush was obviously just getting away before we got there, but brand new deer fence, look, running all the way down the site and all the way around it. Those pictures I took from what were pretty much the same vantage points. This was just after I started, so this is about 6 years ago. So I stood in the same place, and this is the result of about 10 years of actually putting trees in the ground and giving them that kind of head start. Um, it looks pleasing to me. That looks a lot wilder and greener and kind of natural, if you like. But that was the result of a bit of a heavy effort in the first year. So it's really easy to get community support to go and plant lots of these things. Asking people to come back a few years later and meticulously take off all those plastic tree guards and get rid of them, that doesn't seem to happen. Whenever you see these planting schemes, a lot of them around the countryside have all these exploding tree guards. So my first view of Foxburrow was lines and lines of serried trees, up to about 10 foot high now, but in winter, and with these deteriorating kind of tree guards bedraggled, hanging on. So we got our volunteers to help remove them. It took about 3 months of work parties, and they're pretty much all gone now. So this was sort of the result of not only removing the man-made objects, the plastic and the stake, so it had a visual impact, but at the same time, we stopped cutting the sort of the grassland in between the trees. So I have my opinions on Foxburrow, but I think the saving grace of this one, it's been done very, very well. I'll come back to that in a minute, but the saving grace is that in total area, it's about, I worked out it's about 47% planted. So the trees are done nicely in little groups, but a little over half of it was still just sort of unmolested ground. So, but strangely, our predecessors would mow the grassland areas several times during the course of the summer. At times, when I started, a colleague James at the time was popping off to do it every couple of weeks. And the reason it was being done was because there was a perception that the locals that use it heavily wanted it to be clean and tidy, etc. But it was creating a sort of municipal park effect, and we were getting trouble with sort of ill-behaved dog walkers. So we took out the tree guards and we stopped mowing. And after about 2 or 3 months, we got not many, but a handful of complaints. It looks awful. What are you doing? You've lost the plot. Can't you afford to run it, etc. Common complaint was it looks scruffy. And I can't see the long sight lines. I don't like it if I can't see all the way to the end. There's too many leaves in the way. But we sort of wrote it out and explained we were doing it for biodiversity. And then a couple of months after that, in the very same summer, we started to get emails saying, "Oh my goodness, have you seen all the butterflies? It's amazing. What have you done?" And we kind of, got to be a little bit sniffy and said, "We haven't done anything. That's the point." So we stopped cutting the grass and removing it. And the sort of effect of that was all of those common butterfly species like meadow browns and marbled whites. I think I've got a couple of pictures that eat this common generic grass as their food plant. We're having it removed every few weeks, so it really held the populations back. Um, and after a period of time, here you go. So marbled whites, meadow browns, these are the kind of things which absolutely flourished even in the first year. There were lots and lots of them. So you went from almost kind of sterile trees and tree guards and dogs and people to movement. We had butterflies. The other result of not cutting it anymore was that the thistles grew and the teasels and the ragwort and all the things that people consider weeds, but that brought in the chaffinches and the goldfinches and what have you. And then in these pictures, as soon as we kind of abandoned grassland cutting, the second year it started to form a kind of rich thatch. And then we started to get barn owls, and we had a big small mammal influx basically. And then we started to get barn owls and things that hunt them. So this is, don't know if you can see, this is a weasel. So here he is, complete facing the camera. There's his head, there's his white bib. And there he is again, there's his head. He's sort of looking askance down there. But we started to see this is just a bit of spare stone from the Wallers in a pile. The weasel was actually, this was when we took the MP for a meet and greet. So the weasel performed very well. But the point being, within a season, we turned it from looking like a sort of municipal site to something that people had sort of lost interest in and abandoned. And we got a bit of heat for that. But then people started to like to see the wildlife around again. It is a compromise, if as an ecologist, if I was going to take a blank slate like this again, I would do it differently. And if I'm honest, amongst friends, it took me a long time to find a reason to love Foxburrow Wood. But eventually I have. And it is that, this site is on the edge of a very big community. A lot of them helped to, plant the trees. We're right on the edge of Witney. And this is a very, very heavily used site. The local people absolutely love it. If we'd have kept this as some sort of private thing, etc., it would have been an entirely different impact, really. And what we've really done here, because this was private dairy farm, we've basically kind of, yes, we've planted it, but you've almost allowed people and wildlife back onto private land at the same time. So it's not unsurprising to have the small mammals come back when you sort of allow sort of roughness to develop. But the thing, and obviously the things that eat them will follow. But the other interesting things that have started to happen. So this is the southern end of Foxburrow. This is a couple of years ago, so it's a bit more advanced. But you can see where areas have been planted with trees. So this is a hazel copse. And there's various other, bits of ash. There's an orchard up here. It's been done very well. It's not one of those where you've got a block of cherry, block of ash, block of oak. It's been pretty sensitively done, but it's still been designed by a human, hasn't it? Someone got a piece of paper and decided we're going to have a hazel copse here, we're going to have a such and such here. Having sort of backed off a bit on the management and left it, especially the kind of, not mowing all these grassland areas, you can see that what happens, it's not super radical. You just move into this kind of grassy, rough kind of rank grassland stage. And this is what's harbored the common insects and the small mammals. The other thing which has been a little bit surprising, but nature finds a way, is that there's so much dog use here, lots and lots of off the lead dog activity. I sent someone to do a breeding bird survey of this site a couple of seasons in a row, about 3 years ago. There are lesser whitethroats and garden warblers breeding amongst all of this frassy stuff on the ground with dogs tearing around. And it's just, there's so much space. And now there's so much tussocky grassland that percentage-wise, some of these things are managing to go about their business. So not only are we starting to get, of course, blackbirds' nests and song thrush nests in the new hedgerows we planted over the last few years, we're also starting to get some of those, small ground nesting warbler type birds here. So all of this biodiversity wasn't there 15 years ago. It was just cows. Could it be more biodiverse if you'd done it a different way? Yeah, probably. And over time, yes, definitely. But this will sort of catch up. And this is also a very good example of what happens if you plant trees sensitively and thoughtfully, and everything goes well and they survive. So the survivorship here has been really impressive. And it's become a sort of multi-purpose site in many ways. It's so much space that we're just building a little education area up there. But the other thing which I find really interesting and compelling is on this second half of the site, up on this kind of eastern bank. You can see all of these plants which are planted, and they're all getting away and looking very healthy. But for the first time over the last couple of years, we're starting to get self-set scrub coming up. So you've got hawthorn and dog rose and one or two other species which are coming up in the open areas that we didn't plant. That's the action of birds or wind dispersal. Almost certainly it's coming from hawthorn, which was planted a few hundred meters away on the north of the site. The birds have eaten it, pooped it down there, and it's actually spreading. But that's good, that's natural progression of scrub. But I've also found 3 or 4 oak trees now just starting to come up in here, which we definitely haven't planted. And the only place they could have come from is these mature oaks a couple of fields distant. So this was designed, planted, everybody felt good about it. It's gone through various stages. It is starting to sort of, have biodiversity return. But what's going to happen next? So I think Foxburrow is great, but the risk of planting trees at very high density with the intention of, creating some amazing habitat is that more often than not you get this. So the picture on the left is just a snap I took. So this is supposed to be deciduous woodland habitat, principally for biodiversity as mitigation for a development scheme. So this is some extraction stuff which is going on nearby. And trees, you can see that these have been planted like the last thing at a certain density, a certain way, so you can still make out the serried lines. But the trees are, they're all bolted. It looks like crest. This is almost a giant version of a seedling tray in a huge greenhouse that needs pricking out. Don't grow in this density because of competition and lots of other factors. But if you protect them and water them and put spiral guards and kill all the deer and squirrels which might come near them, you've got a pretty good chance of this sort of super high survival. And they all bolt because they're competing with each other and trying to get to the sun first. So you've got these really leggy, weird trees which don't look terribly healthy. And then you can see, so this is a picture in winter, but if you imagine these trees in leaf, there's absolutely hardly any light reaching the ground, so you've got nothing growing at the bottom. So this is probably 25 years old. And of course, there will be some biodiversity and life there, but at the moment, this is sort of okay for a wood pigeon to sit on for a bit, isn't it? Maybe in a couple of 100 years, things will be different. But this is supposed to be a woodland planted to deliver a deciduous woodland biodiversity gain. And you see this kind of everywhere. And this is what will happen to Foxburrow in a couple of years. So, the trees there are so healthy. doing really well, growing rampantly, but they're only that far apart. You can put your hands on two of them. So they'll continue to grow, they'll compete more, they'll get more leggy, and then there'll be a head scratch of it's very dark and weird in here, isn't it? And then so you'll be deciding what to do about it. And there are many things that you could do, and maybe I'll come on to that if you want to know. So I'm starting to cook up a bit of a project because not only are there these sort of mitigation woods planted around the country, there are lots of woodlands like Foxburrow. So Foxburrow was planted, in 2010-ish, but of course there was a big drive to plant millennium woods to celebrate the millennium, in the 2000s. So these are dotted everywhere, centenary woods just up the road from here in Charlbury and Breachwood in Haley, and there's, one on Ancient Garden Village. So they're all over the place, and people are starting to sort of go, it's looking a bit weird. What are we supposed to do with it? So I think there's a project we could do locally where we could take 4 or 5 of these small millennium woods, which are planted with good intentions for biodiversity, and then from here on manage them in 5 different ways and have a long-term monitoring, sort of simple but long-term monitoring regime where we see which sort of direction they go in. But I think there's more to it than just putting trees in the ground if you want really high quality habitat. Um, the picture on the right I put in just because, so this is Foxburrow Wood again, this is the northern end. And when after we did everything I described, it was like, right, no more trees, there's no reason to ever plant a tree in Foxburrow again until there was a strong case made for establishing a new boundary hedge. So this is someone's garden, the deer fence hasn't got much longer in it. So the plan was to put a fence along here, sorry, a hedge along here. So we bought 500 assorted hedgerow plants, and when they said you'll want 500 guards and 500 stakes, we said no, just the plants, please. And that was a bit really. So we stood our ground, but all we did was buy the plants, and all of this stuff is a load of offcut and brash from a hedge laying tournament which was going on in Burford just before we did the hedge. So we put them in the ground with our volunteers, and then my colleague went and picked up 3 loads of brash that had been sort of chucked over the back from this hedge laying competition, and we took it to Foxburrow and we just dropped it unceremoniously on top of these plants that we planted, not worrying if we squashed them. So no tree guards, no watering, no nothing. And a few years later, we've lost 80% of them. So we planted 500 trees, 400 have died because we didn't care and we didn't protect them. But 20% haven't. And 100 hedgerow plants along there is actually quite a lot when you go and look at it now. So give it a few years and those hedges, those trees will grow a bit further. We'll have a perfectly dense hedgerow along there, and you could always gap it up if you wanted to. So this was just a bit of an experiment, what would happen if we put some trees in there. So that was Foxburrow Wood and tree planting. And then the sort of contrast site is Gibbets Hill, which I know some of you have seen. So again, I won't say too much, but for those of you that don't know it, this is Witney. There's the current kind of Madley Park extension of Witney. This is the A40, so Oxford up towards Marcus and on towards Gloucester in that direction. And Gibbets Hill is this bit of farmland here, basically. So in some ways it looks unpromising because it's sort of, constrained by urban development and a big fragmenting dual carriageway. But if you look up here, a couple of agricultural fields away, this is the western end of Ensham Hall. And this that you can see is part of their kind of estate and forestry. And again, if you look closely, this is a mixture of arable conifer plantations, a little bit of deciduous overplanting, and then bits of it around here. A lot of this is proper old-fashioned ancient woodland. So this is genuine Wychwood Forest, which has been left standing, and the rest of it has been mucked about with and overplanted. But so some of the standing tree stock is arable, but the soils, of course, are ancient woodland soils. So this is what they call pores, plantation on ancient woodland soils. Which means that regardless of whether it's got a load of conifers on, there's a good chance that you could restore this, or just allow it to restore itself in due course because you've got a really good seed bank. But in places, you've got uncontrovertible old-fashioned ancient woodland. This is the site pretty much standing from the middle, looking in the direction of that Ensham Hall. So this is our eastern half, and you can see we've got plenty of trees. It's crisscrossed with a nice network of hedgerows. We'll see a bit better in a moment. And it's got plenty of trees. We surveyed them. I think we've got 43 that are mature or mature to veteran. But in the background, so obviously you've got all this wood. There it is. So there's lots of trees, lots of seed source around. Um, so what to do with it? Um, it's really interesting. Two camps came forward really quickly, basically. So one group plant loads of trees. People genuinely thought this was a brilliant opportunity, and we could easily get very large grants for this to buy the trees, do the deer fencing. It's understood, and people would think it's an amazing project. The other group, slightly smaller, but almost as kind of almost as enthusiastic, if you like, thought that we should, because the whole site is under grassland. It's just been hay cut and aftermath grazed for at least 60 years, basically. So no chaos, just the same thing happening every year. But because it's grassland and it's not just, bright green ryegrass pasture. It's not gonna, it doesn't key out as any Rodwell communities much, but there's areas of interest. It's not just terrible silage pasture. But some, people thought we should do a Chimney Meadows style giant hay restoration project and get good quality green hay from somewhere else. I'm sure some of you know the technique, and try to diversify the grassland sward. But both things seem to be incredibly, uninventive. And if you sort of look up and look around, you can see why would this not quickly be subsumed again by native woodland? Look at all the sort of building blocks that are around it. So we quite quickly said, we hear what you're saying, but this is a brilliant opportunity to look at natural succession. And of course, whatever happens here, we've almost got the control of Foxburrow Wood a couple of miles away on the other side of the hill. So we've given ourselves some leeway to try something a bit more progressive and out there because yes, we've already done a lot of the kind of conventional conservation methods on other sites. So despite people's opinions, it was pretty obvious that this should be a kind of, rewilding natural succession project, if you like. And then this famous little tree. So these are the feet of the West Oxfordshire Field Club, the first people we took on there once we knew it was coming our way. So this was just after the site was last hay cut. And this is the first little tree that we saw. So this is one of many, many oak trees which have now been found. But people are like, oh, look, an oak tree. And we're like, oh, yes. So since then, so that was 5 years ago, and these are a couple of pictures. So again, middle looking towards Ensham Hall, you can see the expanse of kind of hay meadow, effectively, I suppose you call it. This is the same field looking from the bottom up. And kind of remember these. So this is the last time I took these pictures a few days after the site was last hay cut and combined, literally from hedge to hedge, no square meter is spared. And this was in summer 2021. Many things have come to pass since then, including fights with neighbours about building houses on it and, aggressive neighbours wanting to continue hay cutting it. So we had a bit of a standoff over the hay cut before it was actually ours, and I won that one. So this has not been managed since that. So now, last year, 2025 was 5 years, or one half a decade, if you like, of rewilding of this land, basically. So this is what it looked like the last time it had a hay cut. And these pictures say this is from an older presentation, but this was a couple of years in. So this was the back end of the summer 23, I think. But you can see those sort of mown areas are starting to, a bit like the Foxburrow experience, is going to rank and tussocky. This is good cover for creatures. Many, many, many more oak trees we started to find. And at first, people were theorizing, oh, they must be falling off the trees and growing. And of course, they are all around the mature trees, but we now know they're widespread right across the site. Different distribution, it's obviously a lot of animal action here, jays, squirrels, but there's absolutely no shortage of trees. We were told in no uncertain terms that they would all get eaten by deer and there would be no tree regeneration. I can tell you what I think about that as well in a minute if you really want to know, but we've like, well, let's see, shall we? I haven't, every year we notice more and more trees, and now you can tell the ones that are the seedlings from any given year, but you can also see the ones that are a few more years old. And we've also had a really interesting quirk here in that after about 3 years of relaxing it, you found small seedlings, 2, 3, 4 year old seedlings, the biggest oaks. The highest grass plant is Deschampsia, the tufted hairgrass, and in a good summer, so Last year, the biomass on the hill was about half what I've usually seen it. The grass hardly grew. Year before, the Dischampsia is like in my face. I have to do that to get through the site. But the oldest oaks have gone right to the top really quickly and then put their leaves on top of it. So they're kind of basking above. But a few of them, you find them and they're only about a meter tall or less, but they look like little oak-shaped oak trees, the traditional sort of shape. Um, and we've had all sorts of experts up there, including a guy called Keith Porter. I don't know if you know him, sort of ancient woodland overlord at Oxford. And he kind of, confirmed my suspicions, that for decades and decades, every year, loads of squirrels and jays plant trees all over, plant, acorns and tree seeds all over the place, as well as all the windfall ones. They germinate quite successfully because there's so very many of them. And then every summer, the combine comes over and chops them all off. And that either kills them or it doesn't. We've all laid hedges, you brutalize them, knock them over, and they regenerate and come back stronger. So the trees, sometimes they're dying, sometimes they're not. But according to Keith Porter, it's not unlikely for some of these tree species to manage 25, maybe a few more years of this kind of treatment. So they can be brutally thrashed within an inch of their life 3 or 4 times before they'll finally give up the ghost. So some of these trees have been hammered over and over again, and they're suddenly not being so, and they've sort of vigorously regrown, but they're 20, 25 years old and they look it. It's just that they're tiny and little. So all sorts of strange things have happened. Um, Also, I'll show you a couple of scrub pictures, but normally the progression of things, if you were to abandon some land in Britain, if it's bare ground, you'll get some ruderal vegetation, and then you get grassland, and the grassland will eventually give way to scrub encroachment. The scrub gets really vigorous, protects a few trees, and then the trees get numerous enough that you get a proto woodland, forms a canopy, shades out the scrub, and the world has moved on. So these are all sorts of transient stages, but usually you need that kind of big scrub encroachment to protect the trees and help them to get away. Um, at Gibbets, we found that not really to be the case. Before I move on, I just noticed one of the things about deer control, we were told without deer control it would be pointless. This is a hedgerow. You can see here. So this is after, 2.5 years. You can still see a very obvious shadow of a browse line here. So when we first went onto this site, every hedgerow, don't know if you remember, Lucy, was pretty much see-through from about 5 foot down. You could just look out to the next field. Um, and I dismissed that as probably deer pressure from the woodlands and the stately home just across the way. So yes, people thought the deer would be a problem. I thought, yeah, to some extent, but not totally. So let's find out. But what I assumed was deer damage is now almost totally gone. You can barely see it anywhere. It was the cattle. It was the aftermath cattle were destroying the hedgerows. It's nothing to do with the deer. And you see the deer traversing the site all the time. So it sort of pays not to jump to conclusions. Um, this picture's here really to show the grassland, but the one diversion that we made from we're not going to interfere, we're going to let nature take its course. Some of you know that we did a big water, restoration project a couple of years ago. So we built 8 water bodies around the site in summer 2024. Um, and the reason we did this is because when you look at the land, if you ferret around, there's really big arterial drains hidden at the bottom of the hills. Farmers of old have gone in, dug it up, chucked in lines of clay pipes, hoping to make it drain better. If it worked, brilliant. If it didn't, they'd put another line in. So you have all these unmapped, crude underground drains running through agricultural land like this. Um, and so what we did was basically the bottom of hills, at the bottom of watersheds, where right where water would naturally percolate through, and then possibly in wet years would pool, or if a tree fell over and pulled up a root base or something, that would be the start of your pond or a marshy area. So yes, we've intervened, but this has been all computer designed to take account of LiDAR and topography data. So these have all been designed to effectively be large, grand scrapes where we've just gouged the land back. Excuse me. And in the process of doing that, the excavation finds the field drains and you just smash them up with a bucket and thump them in with clay. It's not very sort of sophisticated, but for these, So still large tracts of these fields will have functioning agricultural drains under them. Eventually they'll gunk up, but I don't know if that'll take 50 years or 500. So we had the opportunity to get this funded and done to a very high standard, so we took it. But it's only the bits at the bottom of the outflows where we've actually, broken the drainage and severed the connection to the arterial drains here. So it's not total, it's just in certain areas. And the justification was because humans had done this to the land when they wanted farm, they wanted a crop off it. It's fine, that's okay. But it belongs to us now, and we don't do that. We have a different requirement. We want to farm maximum wildlife. And so water is, the elixir of life. And if we could return it, we would. So that was the justification. Now we've done this, we won't do anything else very serious. We still have to get around the site. So rewilding again comes in many forms, doesn't it? But this was the big thing we did to put right the most important piece of damage to this land. So I'll show you this if it works. Yeah, so this was a reference. So these ponds had just been dug at this point. So this is pond 8. The actual pond now is this. So the bits of water that you can see. So this is pond 7. The actual pond is all of this. But these are just the sort of the darkest, the deepest reservoirs, so that in drought years water will draw down and we'll have some sort of repository before it completely dries. So animals can end up in here. And we go. So this is pond 6. So now it's all full. These are all starting to soften in, but the pond itself is sort of this basically. And this one had toad spawn in this spring, which was amazing. But this piece of video, so this is a drone flight, so we have the coordinates for this, so we can do this again in successive years over exactly the same flight path, and it will be part of our monitoring as to how the ponds are changing, etc. But it also gives you a very good look at this site for those of you that haven't been, and for those that have, it kind of gives you a perspective from the air. So this was 2 summers ago. So we're now down at the bottom of the site. So this is a third season. So since this land has been hay cut, already you can start to see the sort of difference between this and the land adjacent, which we don't own. But what you can see on this just about is this sort of pockmarky stuff here. It'll become a bit more apparent as you get closer. This is all blackthorn suckers starting to come out of the hedgerows. You can see the hedges on our side collapsing outwards and repairing that damage. But here is where the rampant scrub is starting to come. And nothing for a couple of years. Things would grow, winter would come, everything died off. Same thing happened next year, down it went. About 3 years ago, I know it sounds weird, it was almost like the whole place sort of sighed and flopped a little bit. And the next summer we had all this rampant scrub. So again, here you can see quite a lot of blackthorn, bits of hawthorn coming out, and you can see this kind of textured cotton wool, topographically weird, interesting grassland compared to this. And this is why it's important. This isn't, triple SI quality grassland, but it's in terms of niches and scruffiness, it's not a homogeneous mess, which is what we would be told, what we were told would happen if we didn't graze it. And then here we're right on top of the hill. This yellow stuff, this is bird's foot trefoil. This red tinge, this is sorrel, just loads of it across the top of the hilltop. So at the moment, it's decent quality grassland. The trees are starting to encroach. The scrub is coming from the edges, but look at the size of it. So this is the old field down to the barn. These are adjacent agricultural fields. It's going to take a very long time before that's covered in, nothing but treetops. I say very long time, 50 years maybe, before it's probably wall-to-wall green. But I reckon for many decades, there'll be like a swirling mosaic of large bits of open grassland. Also, scrub's coming out in wild in various places down here and here, but not in other places. So there will be all sorts of geological and physical and chemical factors that are affecting it. But I think we'll get a good woodland mosaic, which is exactly what our new plan is trying to deliver, and the Oxfordshire Local Nature Recovery Strategy, which I'm sure some of you have heard about. The brilliant thing this time is that scrub is now a priority because it's great habitat for all the reasons I've described. But the sort of hell for leather, we must plant woodlands has sort of softened to, we appreciate swirling mosaic habitats with a bit of this and a bit of that, So it depends, as I say, what you're trying to achieve and what you want to do. But I've just put these last few pictures up and I'll stop talking. This is a bit of land near me in Ensham. So what will gibbets look like as the years go by? It has changed remarkably already in the 2 years since those pictures and that video. So those of you who haven't seen it, come and see it, and if you want to come see it again, always welcome. But you're just starting to get scrub encroachment. This is a bit of land on the edge of the village where I live. So you do get this proto-scrub habitat in little pockets all across the country, but you get it in places like Gibbet. So low value agricultural land, which someone would love to put a load of houses on. So this is stuff on the edge of Ensham, same sort of stuff, low grade agricultural land, reasonable quality hedgerows. Someone mothballed this where they elbowed it through the planning system. So for this is West Ensham extension, blah, 500 houses. So as it's creeping its way through the planning system, it gets neglected, so it looks rubbish and unecological, etc. So this has gone from barren pasture in about 10 or 12 years to this, unfortunately, winter. But if you imagine this with leaves on, the hawthorn, the dog grows, you've got quite vigorous scrub starting to form. And in places where it coalesces, here's your ash trees coming up in the middle because the browsers can't get to them. Same bit of land. It's a pretty extensive tract, so you can see it's publicly open and people walk around it. But in the distance, you can just make out the rooftops of the houses, which went in a couple of years ago on exactly this sort of stuff over there. And in the meantime, this has been, left to its own devices, rampant scrub coming out of hedgerows. Look, this is, if you can imagine this in leaf, this is lots and lots of vigorous hawthorn starting to spread out across this land. So, for ecological impact assessment, it's scrub, it's rubbish, nothing lives here, let's build houses. I've seen more than 200 meadow pipits on this place in the middle of February when it's bitterly cold, the two coldest weeks of the year. They all decamp down from wherever they come in the north, and you see hundreds of meadow pipits. I bet the ecologist didn't pick that up by going on a cold day in February. But nonetheless, this is the sort of stuff that I think is the future nature reserves of our country. But it's the sort of land which is much more lucrative to do something else with. It's not very good for agriculture. Attempts to grow crops have never been very successful. So like gibbets, it sort of settles into in and out of cattle and sheep grazing, and eventually someone decides, someone gets the nod and they build the houses and gone it is. But this is almost 10 to 15 years into that sort of happy stride towards woodland. And if you let areas like this just sort of get away, that's exactly what you'd happen. And so again, same bit of land. Again, today, grey day, no leaves on anything, but at a distance, it looks like very, very heavy scrub. But you get a bit closer, it's not at all, is it? There's nice hawthorns, but in between, a few rabbits are either keeping the grass down here. No one's been in here with a strimmer or a mower in 15 years. It's not wall to wall thorny scrub, is it? So, a bit of patience, and you get some quite interesting ecological results. But again, there you go. That's the end result, isn't it? It's just scrub, it's rubbish. So this is the bit by the factories. So this you can tell is earmarked for development. Someone's found a few slow worms on here. Actually, I don't want to be flippant. There's the last common lizards in the village on here. So there's some protected species, which means the law is triggered and people jump and start moving them and putting fences in. But what about the scrub? Give it left that alone for another 5 years. You can have nightingales, I'm sure of it, and lots of other things. So it's just the way it is, isn't it? And it's rare that you have organisations like us that like to do kooky things and resist the pressure to farm the land, tenant it out, build houses, etc. So all we really wanted to do was see what happens over time. And the thing I didn't mention, and the things you guys already know if you've been there, is I kind of, it's not really controvertible ecologically that you'll get a better outcome from this approach than trying to design it yourself. But it's surprisingly how few of these attempts to do this either actually happen at a medium scale or are fully documented. At the one end, everybody gets excited about NEP and it's, the best thing since sliced bread. But when we try to do this at a modest, middling sized farm scale and take it out of production, there's 1,001 reasons why it won't work. This won't happen, that won't happen. So we decided to stand our ground, do it anyway. But we've engaged in long-term partnerships with Freshwater Habitats Trust that have built the ponds for us.
And with with Oxford University's ecosystem restoration unit, we've come up with a kind of 100-year monitoring plan. So those of you who've been there know we've got 4 research plots on the site with all sorts of gizmos buried, temperature recorders, carbon capture recorders, and we've been doing stuff with bioacoustic microphones. So it's an opportunity to trust your gut, but also we'll back it up with some good quality monitoring and science. So um, those are two different approaches. I know which one ultimately I like best, but it is kind of horses for courses. But I do think that we need more of this kind of extreme end stuff like gibbets. This is the most extreme site of our land holdings. As I said, we've got more kind of understandable, prosaic, if you like, approaches to nature conservation. But what we're doing at the moment isn't working, is it? So I think we do need to try different things, and I think gibbets will surprise people. There'll be some interesting happy accidents along the way. We've already seen some weird and wonderful things come through. And those of you who have been there know it's big enough and, topographically interesting enough that it's not a bad hour's ramble. And I had 2 or 3 people in the course of the last year sort of turn around and go, doesn't really feel like Oxfordshire here, does it? And it doesn't. It feels actually quite savanna-y when you're in the middle of it now. You've got the scrub, the trees coming up. But it's exactly what Oxfordshire would look like in early stages of succession if it was allowed in more places. So it's not as weird as it looks. It's actual nature recovery happening. So thank you for your kind attention. I hope that made some sort of sense, but I'm happy to answer any questions at all.
That was great, Neil. Thank